Welcome to today's webinar entitled The Value of Active Space Management Warehouse Space. My name is Billy Zadek, Manager of Special Programs for APA. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. The webinar recording will be posted to the APA webpage under the Continuous Learning tab later today. Professional continuing education certificates are being offered for today's program and will be sent to you later this afternoon. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Please type your questions in the chat box and they will be answered in the order they are received. If we run out of time and we still have questions, responses will be sent directly to the person asking the question by one of our presenters. At this time, it's my pleasure to turn this over to our speakers for today's webinar, Mitch Kilcrease and Carolyn Farley. Carolyn, take it away.
Thank you so much, Billy. We really appreciate the opportunity to present today. My name is Carolyn Farley, and I am a director with the Huron Consulting Group. I joined Huron following about a 25-plus year career on university campuses with specific responsibility for facilities operations and management. So bring some history of my own to this and some experience with managing these types of projects. So Mitch, please.
Yeah, my name is Mitch Kilcrease. I serve as the Assistant Vice President for the Office of Business Services at Florida State University, where I oversee a series of auxiliary enterprises, facilities, and operations. Part of that work is in conjunction with shipping and receiving and our postal operation and a series of warehouses, which is how I come to you to this presentation today. And so I've been doing higher education for about 35 years now and have been engaged in all kinds of enterprises, but this was a unique one even to me. So Carolyn, we want to go to the next slide maybe? So this really all came about, like all good things. The pandemic brought a lot of the project objectives and outcomes out for us. During the pandemic, we really found out that we had some real gaps in how we were ordering materials and goods, how we were receiving materials and goods, and how we were storing those materials and goods and then distributing them. And it really highlighted some really challenges and gaps that we had in our own operations and how we interacted with each other in various different departments on campus. And so with that as kind of the backdrop, we realized that those problems and challenges really extended long beyond the pandemic and really were into our day-to-day efforts that we have relative to those needs on our campus. So about 6 months ago, we engaged Huron in an effort to do an assessment. And we asked them really to put a focus on inventorying our existing warehouse facilities and the details and the documentation of what was being stored in those facilities. We didn't have a really good handle on all of that. We wanted them to review the technology that we were using to not only receive items, but inventory items and to track items, that not all of those items were integrated overall. We also recognized early on that there are a lot of people doing this a lot better than we were. And so we asked them to go out and benchmark some best practices for us and to help us understand how we could maybe build a model that would be better for us to have here. And then overall, really to help us identify not how we need to currently operate in our warehousing needs, but to help us visualize what that may need to look like into the future as we move out. We had some unique challenges there with facilities possibly going away or being repositioned or repurposed. Ultimately, we asked for a series of deliverables, an inventory of existing warehouse and storage units, an implementation roadmap of opportunities for greater organizational and operational efficiency, a business case report that we could use with senior leadership to kind of express what our needs were and our operational challenges, and then ultimately some next steps. And we're on the very beginning of this endeavor. So next slide, Carol. So early on, it became very important for us probably to create a vocabulary, since we were really working across multiple areas, from facilities to academics to auxiliaries, and to have kind of a unique vocabulary that we could all call a apple an apple and an orange became really important for us. And so for the purpose of the work that we undertook and that Carolyn's team undertook, we really defined warehouse services as those areas that were shipping and receiving. We have a Grainger MOR contract on this campus, how that interacts with our shipping, receiving, and products that we store on campus, and space requirements associated with various different functions, whether they be academic, facilities related, or auxiliary related. We also thought that not everything is a warehouse, and that became very evident when we figured out what we were calling warehouses during this process. But understanding that a building is part of one of needing to store goods and or merchandise. And then last but not least was storage, making sure that we had a definition for storage that we all understood and could agree upon, from short-term storage to long-term storage to deep storage to just-in-time storage. So storage means a lot of things to a lot of people, so understanding that was very important. Next slide, Carolyn. So part of the recommendations, and once again, we're on the front end of this effort with Huron's recommendation, was to create kind of a management group, since this is a shared responsibility and challenge across departments. We needed to have a series of guiding principles that the various different stakeholders could embrace to help us manage this project and to help us guide our way through it. So with Huron's help, they helped us develop these guiding principles that number one, that warehouse was critical university asset that needed to be actively managed. We didn't have an infinite amount of warehouses and storage space, and what we did have needed to be used effectively. That all university warehouse belongs to the university, not any one department, so those can be reallocated and repurposed when necessary and needed. The allocation of space would need to adhere to some principles aligned with the FSU strategic plan. So just because we're currently using a warehouse for its purposes, does it really meet the and align with the university's strategic plan and efforts and desires? And then space-related decision-making needed to be informed with quality data. It wasn't just knee-jerk reaction, but we really need to have a means of collecting data, assessing data, and using that data in our decision-making. Space related to policies needed to be reviewed on a regular basis to make sure that we were staying current and relevant, and that we were meeting the needs of the campus community and our partners in all of this. And last, fees, what it costs us to do that, to make sure that we fully costed out all of the related costs and from storage, from not only just maintaining a facility, but also the staff resources and tools and assets that go in to doing that, that we had a fee structure that properly reflected those needs. Like any good project, you have challenges, and we're still working through some of our challenges, but the storage solution development really, what became very evident for me in this process is perspective. Where you stand at any given point in this process, it depends on what you see as your needs and how you operate, and that may not be the same across the table with your other departments. So understanding that we had challenges of everybody, understanding what everybody's perspective as it related to this project was important. Practices, making sure that we had really well-developed and well-informed practices that worked well, that everybody could embrace and that would help us manage all of this has been a challenge and continues, because how everybody looks at their own individual space and may have practices different from kind of a collective approach to managing those practices. And then collectively, you know, one of the things that became evident once we started figuring out everything that we had physically in our facilities and our operations, it became apparent that we may have more assets and resources available to be used if we properly use them and maybe cleaned them up and reorganized it and created some processes and practices around that, that we may have enough assets to handle a lot of what we're trying to deal with on campus. And then color of money became an important part of trying to understand this. As an auxiliary, you know, we work from the perspective of whatever we hunt and kill is what we eat tomorrow. But a lot of our other units have no skin in the game. There's no cost to them being able to use the storage facilities. And so therefore, it's not always incented for them to have best practices or use or to manage that asset to its fullest capacity. So understanding who's paying for what and how that money is being used needs to take into effect all aspects of our storage and warehouse solutions, and working through all of those details. Goals, like anything else, it became very important for us to really identify some goals about understanding on what we wanted to try to achieve relative to being more effective in our receiving, inventory, and tracking of equipment and supplies. And in order for those goals to be realized, we really needed to have greater visibility into what was being stored and where it was being stored. We needed better systems or mechanisms to understand the data or the tracking of items that were coming into campus. You know, early on in the pandemic, it became very clear that we were ordering all kinds of stuff, but we may not know where it was landing, and we didn't know where it was going once it got here. So tracking activity, cost avoidance, recognizing what is already on hand, so we're not spending money 2 and 3 different times. And then prompt action, recognizing when our supplies and inventory are low. One of the things we found out is we didn't have a very good inventory system in place to really understand that what we were storing in any given facility, we may have in other facilities because we didn't know it was there, because we didn't have an integrated approach from ordering to inventory to storage. And then last, really, once again, back to the pandemic, emergency response. This was all brought about because we had to shift gears and really change what we were bringing in, where we were storing it, and how it was being distributed. And that lingered on after the pandemic. We're in Florida, we have hurricanes, and we have responses that we have to manage on a fairly regular basis. And having a good mechanism, structure, and framework to manage our emergency management became a really important goal for us to try to solve and to be more efficient with how we do all of that.
Very good, thanks, Mitch. So as we stepped into this conversation and into this engagement with the FSU team, we determined that we needed a variety of information in order to inform this effort. And so we wanted both quantitative, so data. So we're asking for things like, you know, floor plans and square footage and what's assigned to whom and what kind of activity is moving through there on a regular basis. But we also, as you'll note, you know, we spoke with a variety of campus stakeholders who have a vested interest in what's happening there. We literally walked through the vast majority, I can't say quite all of the warehouses there at FSU, but we walked through the vast majority of them. And those are the types of things that add the culture and the color of the campus. And you get a better sense of, okay, I perceive that I see some priorities being reflected in what is happening here. Let me go ahead and test those as we start to kind of work our way through. We did some concept testing to kind of share some ideas. You know, this is something that I saw. Might you look at it differently? Are there some ways that we could be approaching this differently? We had a standing committee that worked with us and that walked through kind of the information as we gathered it from what we call kind of a current state. This is kind of where we see you are. And then we started looking at, and here are some needs and the roadmap for the future. And this was the group that guided that along the way. And as Mitch mentioned, we looked at best practices of comparably sized institutions that are handling similarly complex set of factors that impact their day-to-day work, to see if there were things that we could be learning from them that would inform the opportunity here at Florida State. And as we stepped into our recommendations overview, there were some key areas that we've really focused on, performance being one of them. Does the space being used function in a way that supports the need adequately? An example is the receiving of custodial supplies. If they arrive to a central location and are then distributed out from there, a cross-docking situation may be the best arrangement because it allows for it to flow off the delivery truck and onto a distribution truck with minimal handling. And so looking for opportunities to kind of enhance performance where perhaps it was lacking. Active management is language that we used really consistently. What served as the highest and best use before for a particular space may not remain that situation. As Mitch mentioned, there was a period of time in which getting the PPE onto campus into a central location became the highest priority. So other priorities needed to change. And I think that's one of the things that we can step into when it comes to space, quote unquote, ownership, is that we think that it's not going to change. And, you know, my standard statement is that I've seen deans fight for money, but I've seen them kill for space. Like literally, the space is the thing. And particularly when it comes to the development and build out of space on campus, storage space is often the thing that falls off the table during the value engineering phase. And it's the first thing that the operator misses when they get into the building. Like, you took away my storage space and now I have to figure out what I'm going to be doing with tables and chairs and other things that allow this facility to function in the way it's intended. But active management plays a role in kind of helping to keep things moving along. The technology and equipment, you know, so many campuses are managing a labor shortage, particularly in the facilities area. And so relying on the long tenured employee who has all of that institutional memory and is able to bring that to life, you know, I'm looking for this thing, and that person would know exactly where that thing is. Those people are starting to retire. They've already retired. And we're needing to find systems that replace employees who are often of a shorter tenure. They're not staying with us to the extent that they have in the past. And so needing to find ways that allow us to manage what we're managing through the use of the right tools. And then the process. You know, I think one of the things that we learned, I talked a lot about the haves and the have-nots, and they exist on every campus. The have-nots, those who do not currently have storage space but are seeking it, need to have a process through which to pursue it. And so that's a big part of the conversation that we had is, what are the various levels of storage that are needed? And are there some ways that we can be meeting at least some of those needs with the space that exists, and how can we create it where it doesn't exist? So we're going to walk through some of the opportunities as they were identified. This first one, short-term opportunities, I think also low-hanging fruit. Mitch has referenced it a bit. Records management is an area that often just accumulates. It's one of those things that, you know, if a department is on it every year, then it looks great. If there's transition and it starts to slip, it can continue to slip. And this is an area that can consume storage, but has very little value if it is held past the required time frame in which it is needed. And so making sure that that is addressed, and you know, it's one of those efforts that can be addressed either with on-campus resources or potentially a contracted service that could make short work of it, given the right instruction. A reevaluation of the contents of the warehouses. I would say that for those that we interviewed who had responsibility for warehouse space, all of them felt confident that they were using it in very responsible ways. And they really were using it in responsible ways for their department. If you start to look at it from an institutional perspective and say, from a broader perspective, the institutional needs reflect some different needs than those of your department, and they may be higher value needs. And so really making sure that that lens is being applied appropriately, and perhaps doing some cross-evaluation of items stored so that there is some agreement that everybody's kind of lined up appropriately. And again, looking at existing utilization, there are some spaces that, you know, a few years ago in the pandemic, the PPE needed to be right there, centralized to the campus, readily accessible. It's still important. COVID hasn't fully left our environment, but it may not need to be front and center anymore. So we talked a lot about concentric circles, what needs to be stored in the center of campus. Somebody's touching it almost on a daily basis. What could potentially be a mile, 2 miles off campus, and what could be even further, because really it's only touched once a quarter or once a year, or we really don't expect to touch it until we move it back into the renovated building. And using that lens to help make decisions about what needs to be taking up that really valuable space there in the middle campus. The application of some management procedure and process, and this really varies, and Mitch, I invite you to chime in. We looked at and recommended some type of a structure and oversight of the collective warehouses. So currently they're being managed by the department that occupies them, but is there some need for some broader ownership of this? And on some campuses, this could take the form of really a formal governance process. On other campuses, and I think FSU was a good example of this, they really wanted a group, but they felt that using that group more as kind of a project-driven group, we want you to take care of these particular things, was something that would be more in line kind of with the culture of the place. And certainly, you know, any project can and should be aligned with the culture of the place. But finding ways of opening up the opportunities, what kinds of procedures, what kind of process can we put in place for the have-nots? Remember, there are those who need it that don't have it, and would appreciate an opportunity and a way of acquiring some. How can we put these things in place? And that's something that this group can work on, to be supporting this, the opportunity for other departments to be taken care of in a way that needs to be happening for them.
Carolyn, the only thing that I would add to that real quick is that for this project, it's really broken up into two kind of functions. There's the front end of the problem of dealing with all of our current challenges of figuring out what's in spaces, how to get rid of all of that stuff, how to loosen up space and put in place. So you have a lot of people within departments that have some ownership of that, right? So you have to understand what their needs are and appreciate and understand their concerns and issues on it. That then translates into a plan on how we start dealing with that. And then hopefully we get to this point in the process where we've created and cleaned up and put in place the systems and processes. Now we need to have a shared mechanism to make sure that we manage and maintain those assets moving forward so that we don't get back into the same spot that we were in. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but I kind of see it as two functions: a heavier lift on the front end and more of a management oversight on the back end.
Right, right. And you'll see here some annual responsibilities, you know, looking at the utilization of the space that is available to the campus, and is it being used for kind of the highest and best use, or have some new needs been identified that perhaps would displace something that currently exists. The development of space. Are there opportunities either to be acquiring or developing, sharing space with perhaps a campus adjacent service that would allow the institution to expand the amount of space that's available? And then the procedure review, kind of making sure that the procedures, the process are staying current with the identified needs, so that the opportunity to get the space when a department needs it is maintained and facilitated.
Once again, I think she points that out is early on in the process, more meetings, more time, more effort, because you're dealing with a lot of how do we improve upon current circumstances. Once that's in place, I think you're in a better spot for this group to really be then managing. May not be as frequent, but still necessary.
Yeah. And then some key performance indicators. And these were some things that we identified the institution can choose to use these. Perhaps there are others. We were looking at everything from the work orders associated with moving tables and chairs around campus, the activity through different receiving areas, the activity through surplus property, which is another warehouse service. If there are new services that are developed, and we'll talk about it just-in-time storage ability here in a few moments, if that catches on and it is needed by more and more departments, is it possible to expand that in other ways?
Carol, on the key performance indicators, I think one of the things that's really important on this is there's a lot of existing data that's already there that can help inform a lot of your decisions, but we usually don't link that information from like procurement to inventory management to shipping and receiving to even outgoing deliveries. And so there's an infinite amount of data that can be brought in if it's properly organized to help inform a lot of your performance indicators.
Yeah, for sure. And I think handling is one that can often get lost. That sense of how many times something has been handled since it arrived to campus through its disposition. You know, one of the things that we identified was that something that ended up eventually being disposed of was actually stored before it was disposed. And it was like, can we skip this step? Like, I understand there may be a reason for holding it, but can we eliminate that reason in order for it to just continue its way off campus so that we're not occupying campus precious space to be able to handle that.
Carolyn, real quick on the systems, I do want to touch on something real quick on that because this was one of the major driving forces. Is we have multiple systems on this campus that could benefit a lot of how we operate. So a prime example that came into clear focus during the pandemic is once we got products into campus, we were able to scan them into our SC Logic platform for distribution on campus. So we had an automatic tracking system already in place so that when inventory was available, we were able to take it and move it around. So if we hadn't really ran into the issue of emergency management, we probably never would have looked at that system of being to be able to pivot and reposition for a different purpose. And so once again, I think looking across your departments and organization to look at the systems that you already have in place, and is there a way to either link them, reposition them, or affiliate them somehow to help you achieve your goals?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's a good point. Thank you. Which brings us to technology. We did a bit of a systems assessment, and one of the things that we determined was there was some really good use of technology. There was some really good use of a variety of technology. And so we found 2 or 3 different receiving systems. So there was a lot of intentionality around the stewardship of what was brought to campus. It just wasn't integrated in a meaningful way to allow, you know, perhaps somebody at a higher level, you know, if a storm is coming and Mitch needs to get a handle on where, you know, the water supply is for a storm, it would probably involve a few phone calls to the people who are the keepers of the systems, as opposed to being able to look into a single system and find it in a single location. And so we've had some conversation around that and ways in which some of that information could be brought together to provide that kind of source of truth for the campus inventory. And I think so many campuses are looking towards an enterprise technology plan. There are many steps in this process that can occur in anticipation of that, many of which would integrate naturally with enterprise systems. But getting things in place in anticipation of having that enterprise system allows you to leverage that investment to a greater extent. So something that we need to keep in mind and find ways of bringing some of that information together more intentionally in anticipation. And this is the storage solution development that I spoke a little bit to earlier. We recognized, and a lot of it was walked into a warehouse and we see that there are 3 or 4 pieces of furniture that are boxed. And we simply asked about them and it's like, well, the department ordered them, but they're not ready for them. That's not unusual. If there's a renovation going on, or perhaps an office is moving, but they haven't moved yet, they're not ready to receive that. Everybody, nicest group of people that were involved in this process, everybody was very much committed to supporting one another and finding those short-term solutions. The challenge was that they kind of ideally need to be on some type of a clock or on some type of an incentive program, perhaps a charge for a square foot of storage after you exceed a certain time frame, in order to encourage things to keep moving. If they're allowed to rest for a period of time, someone may get accustomed to them being there and not feel incentivized to keep them moving along. So Mitch and his team have identified some opportunity within their receiving area, and the facilities department is doing something similar to say, can we organize this in a way that says, as an example, for the first 2 weeks, we've got you, no worries, it'll be here. If it extends beyond 2 weeks and up to 3 months, we will store it for you, and that will occupy square footage that requires a fee associated with it in order to incentivize that movement of items from the landing location to their ultimate destination. The second type of space that we identified is swing space. And for those of you who've been involved with renovation and construction, this is that, place that you go in between. So you have to move out of a facility that's going to be renovated, and some of your belongings or supplies, equipment goes with you, and some of it may go into storage. That renovation may be over the course of the summer slammer, as I like to call them, 3 months long, in and out, need some storage for that period of time, or it could be a larger project that requires up to a couple of years. And we talked about both on and off campus options for that. And that the off campus ability, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the best practice information. There are a variety of ways of handling it. The nice thing about working with some off campus vendors is that it can swell and compress based on the need at a particular time. It's not something that the institution is necessarily maintaining itself, although there may be some incentive to do that for certain projects. But I think there's also the opportunity to say, we've got this longer term need. We don't need to touch these items for this period of time, so they can go 3 miles off campus and we'll be perfectly fine with that. So kind of sussing out those details in order to make that decision.
Carolyn, you touched on that with the concentric circles earlier. There are things that we're storing really close to the campus that really probably belong in deep or long-term storage that we don't need to get to. And there's probably things in long-term deep storage that we need to be able to access. So aligning kind of where the facilities, what we store in those facilities and how we use those as those concentric circles grow out becomes an important part of how we evolve our program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then that ongoing storage, and that, takes a variety of forms, and, a lot of interesting players in that. The research enterprise, we spoke with them, and they have some equipment that's not currently in use, but it's really expensive equipment. To dispose of it and potentially then have to replace it is a very expensive proposition. So can we have a place to store this? We don't know for how long, but we need some storage for research. Other things, compact book storage has become a very popular conversation. It's a bit outside of a traditional warehouse conversation, given some of the conditioning elements that need to be in place, but it certainly is becoming a big conversation as campuses try to decompress their libraries and create more interactive environments. And then, it could be extra beds and mattresses for the housing department. So it's a real breadth of need that may always need to be there, but it may need to flex a bit in its size and scope based on what else is going on campus. So as we stepped through this, we focused on what's really foundational to the enterprise that needs to happen in order to know that what we have, we're using to its highest and best use. And so we talked through some of those steps that we recommended to really ground the what is to follow. As Mitch said, this was kind of the first of what we anticipate will be a few steps into getting them prepared for what is to come, to kind of manage what they anticipate as a future need. The next step is the leading. It's the development of things like the just-in-time storage and the swing space storage that are there to respond when those needs arise. It's not if they're going to arise, we know they're going to arise. And so finding ways to anticipate them effectively that allows the institution to manage costs associated with them and to manage the effort of getting things to where they need to be when they need to be out of the way of a project that's upcoming. And then ultimately transformation. You know, I'll mention as we get into some of the best practices, there's some campuses that have really taken a very robust approach to their warehousing that, you know, kind of moves beyond what most campuses would envision, but it is what their campus needs to kind of wrap their arms around what has become a fairly significant issue for many. And when it comes to some of the tools that are left, or, you know, they're not simply left, they're certainly something that we discussed with the steering committee as we talk through it. As part of the roadmap, we look at how long things are going to take. Let's put some information together. Let's set this on a priority list and say, okay, we need to start with records management. That needs to be one of the very first things. Let's set a goal of having that complete this calendar year and then step into the next task. So we try to get as specific as is practical to be when it comes to determining the timeline for things to happen. And then we also look at the resourcing strategies that are associated with it. You know, some things take a significant amount of effort and a significant amount of money. So two resources that most campuses are challenged to put together in a meaningful way. But we try to break it down so that there is some sense of, okay, if I assign a staff person to this, they can expect to spend this much time on it on a weekly basis until the task is complete. And as far as the investment goes, we broke it into three categories, kind of the under $200,000 investment, a cost between $200,000 and $500,000, and then beyond $500,000 as a way for the campus to kind of determine, you know, we're prepared, we have this much to work with, let's look at what this can cover in these list of opportunities that have been identified. And again, that action timeline of how long, what is the duration of a particular task. And then when it comes to the human resources, you know, as I mentioned very early on, labor shortages are real. And so sometimes problems haven't been solved simply because the hands are not available to address them. And so wanting to take a look at what are the options available. It's certainly the current resources that are there on the campus. It could be new resources that are hired, either permanent positions or temporary positions that are brought on to address a particular issue. It could be some type of a partnership or collaboration among departments, or perhaps a third party is brought in. You know, when we were talking about records management, there are a lot of contracted companies that are available to support both the sorting and the disposition of records, if that is something that seems like the appropriate investment of both time and dollars on behalf of the institution. And stepping into some of those best practices, and you know, these scale in really different ways depending on the institution and kind of what their identified needs are. There is some movement towards the consolidation of receiving on campuses. You know, I mentioned Mitch does some receiving around the postal area, and they manage a lot for students and departments. But facilities is also receiving not just their materials, but also materials for departments. So there is receiving happening in a few different locations. Given the volume of packages that are coming to students alone in these environments, many campuses have said, we cannot handle all of these vehicles moving to the center of our campus to make these deliveries. Our roads were not meant to be that. We want to be a pedestrian-friendly campus. We've got to find another solution. And for some, that solution has been moving that receiving location to the fringe, if not off campus, and then managing the traffic that's within the campus that's doing kind of that last mile delivery to various locations. So this is an ongoing conversation in a lot of environments, and I think something that is not likely to change given the prevalence of, you know, the online ordering craze that really settled in during the pandemic. Some institutions are looking at palletized storage. They are offering a 4x4 pallet or a 4x8 pallet to a department. Okay, if you'd like to store, you know, the next year's worth of publications and you want to pull them as you need them, we will, you know, put them on a pallet. We will wrap them in shrink wrap so that they stay contained and clean. And when you need them, we will provide access to that. And the department is paying on a square foot or per pallet basis for that storage to be managed by the campus, but it is not necessarily something that needs to be held within their department, which helps to address that shrinking kind of departmental storage that we've all experienced in the past. And then fee for storage, there is some interest in, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, in using off-campus storage facilities. And certainly that is something that, good grief, I've moved recently and I think I occupy 3 different storage facilities on my way to the new location. And they were plentiful. It was not hard to find them. Departments are finding them too. But it can be difficult to know that the terms and conditions under which they have been secured are in alignment with the institution's preferences. It's also hard to know if they've gotten a truly competitive rate. And so some institutions have identified ways of kind of pursuing that more intentionally, and we'll talk about that here. So University of Michigan was the campus that we looked into here, and they have what they call a U-Manage program. And what they really wanted to do was to meet the needs of the have-nots, some of whom have very short-term needs. Maybe somebody's having a large departmental conference and they have a lot of materials for a very short period of time, and I need a 10 by 10 locker for 2 months. But what they determined to do is, let's set a threshold. For them, it was a $25,000 limit to both move and store materials. Anything that fell below that could take advantage of this program. And they put out an RFP to negotiate terms, conditions, and rates so that the institution knew that things were covered appropriately by insurance, that the rates that they were getting were competitive and in line with what they should be receiving. And it also established a fairly easy to use approach for a department. Say I'm the one that's hosting the conference and in need of a storage unit for 2 months. I have a pre-approved list of vendors that I can contact directly, can issue a PO. In some cases, some campuses allow the use of a purchasing card to be used for the securing of that particular facility and for the monthly payments associated with it. So they decided to kind of meet the market, support the local economy through engaging with the businesses in the area, but to make sure that it was done in a way that benefited the institution most specifically. And so I think, you know, I noted here, Tallahassee is a very competitive market. As Mitch mentioned, they have a lot of storms in Florida. Tallahassee happens to be a bit inland, so they store a lot of response materials in that particular area. So it's a very competitive area to secure storage facilities. But this is an opportunity and something that the institution is considering as a way for kind of managing those costs and providing the resource to the departments that remain in need. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that when it comes to this type of activity, change management needs to be a part of the conversation. You know, the book from a few years ago, Who Moved My Cheese? Like, I've had the storage unit for 20 years. I've been managing it responsibly. I feel like I've done everything that I'm supposed to, and now you're telling me that I need to give up some or a portion or all of it to this other institutional priority. The transparency that's needed to really foster the buy-in to help both the haves and the have-nots understand why we're looking at this space differently. I think the pandemic really shone a light on the fact that campus space is expensive, whether it's occupied or not. Institutions were able to save some money by setting back thermostats and not turning on lights, but I don't think it produced the type of savings that the average person would have assumed. And so the return from that particular set of circumstances, on top of the expiration of the HERF funding and those types of things that kind of buffered our way back into on-campus life, those things have changed. And now we're in an environment where that active management has become a much bigger conversation on those campuses. And the need for there to be a level of engagement, you know, as Mitch said, that project management committee, what are their roles? What are they involved in? How do they hold one another accountable? But it's also helping the balance of the institution understand, we hear what you're saying when you say you don't have what you need. We're working towards some solutions. Let's start the conversation so we have a very good understanding of what's needed so the institution can be planning accordingly. And all of this can be supported by an effective change management rubric that allows everybody to have a good sense of not just what's happening in the moment, but what is to come. And really, effective change management, you know, people need to feel valued, they need to be heard. That has a lot to do with the involvement in the process that we had when we were on campus. The processes and procedures really need to be clear and aligned with those in need so that they meet that expectation. There needs to be some, I use the word governance here, it could be active management. The decision-making process needs to be transparent and needs to be data-driven. People need to understand that there are some very plain facts associated with kind of where we've landed and where we're going. Regular communication so that people have a good understanding of what's to come is certainly part of that. And knowing that the sponsorship is there, that the leadership of the institution is aligned with the process that's been identified, and that level of buy-in is kind of an expectation, and that everybody is working toward bringing people to that common conversation. So with that, we're kind of getting to our wrap up here, and happy to facilitate and take some questions. I don't see anything in the chat right now. Billy, have you seen anything I've missed?
Yes, we have a couple questions for you. First question is, what asset inventory programs are used to track items in various storage facilities?
So Mitch, you mentioned SC Logic.
Yeah, so that's one of the challenges we have is we don't have what I would consider a real good inventory management system that's currently in place. It's one of the things that we're getting ready to address. So you have the inventory management, which tells you, well, back up. So in our instance, we have Jaeger, which is what our procurement office uses to bring supplies on campus. Once they get on campus, and this is our challenge, is we don't always know where it lands. And so we don't close the loop on it. And so then how does that material get pushed back out to the various different areas and pushed into areas for inventory management? Once it gets into my world, I know that I can take it from this location and distribute it where it goes, because the SC Logic product allows for us to do that, and we currently already do it with our mail services. So one of the questions we have out right now, can we broaden that and tie that in a little bit more effectively? So I think I may have officially talked all around that question and not really answered it, but the bottom line of it is we don't have a good solution in place right now.
And there are a variety of them available, and I can, when we put the materials together, provide a list of a few others that you may consider. But yeah, Jagger and SC Logic certainly are two.
Okay. Our other question is there a cost per square foot of space that is used to determine the cost for operating the warehouse operations?
What we used in this particular case, the departments that occupy the warehouses at Florida State in particular pay for maintenance and utilities associated with them. They are not currently paying a fee per square foot. So their cost for their facility is relatively low compared to the open market, where there are departments that are paying between $7.50 and $8 a square foot. So that was one of the things that we recognized. When you're getting that good a deal, it's really hard to give it up. And trying to incentivize that active management, because certainly the department that's paying almost $8 a square foot off campus, they are driven to reduce their footprint because they would like to reduce the bill that they are receiving on that square footage. And so we talked about, you know, are there ways that we can be finding to kind of level the playing field, not necessarily increasing the costs on campus, but finding ways to recognize that balancing these issues is important. Mitch, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, from my perspective, the just-in-time storage is something that I'm really interested in, because a lot of what the campus is paying for, they're paying a premium to have items stored in off-campus facilities and operations, which that cost is much higher than if we were to get our operations structured properly, that we could offer that same service at a reduced cost, but still increase revenues for our auxiliary enterprises. And then there's just basic logic stuff where we have areas, we have an innovation park where they're storing large quantities of items way off campus and paying a premium, and they can throw a rock and hit one of the warehouses that we manage that could be much cheaper and closer for them to be able to do that. So those are some of the things that we've got to figure out is the price point, where we need to be at, where we need to be competitive. But I'm confident we can wind up saving the university significant amount of money if we get this properly structured and organized properly.
Okay, well, that's all of the questions we have in the chat box at the moment. If anyone has a question, we have time for maybe one or two additional questions. If you would like to ask Carolyn or Mitch a question, please type it in the chat box. So while we're doing that, I want to just say, Carolyn and Mitch, thank you so much for taking time to do this today. It's been very insightful, and I'm sure you're going to get follow-up from people who are going to think about this, go back and look at things, and basically have questions for you. And we did get another question that came in. Do you have some guidelines on actually bringing storage into the warehouse?
Do we have guidelines of actually bringing items
storage into, yeah, items for storage into the warehouse?
So methods for doing so, sorry.
Yeah.
I don't know that. Yeah, I don't know that we have. I don't know that we have any guidelines for what's coming into storage. I mean, most stuff comes in through central receiving, and or through facilities receiving, and then gets pushed back out to the departments or units or whatever. Then it goes into storage. But we don't have really, that's part of the challenge I think we have, is we don't have defined guidelines of what kind of items need to go into storage and make sense to go in the type of storage spaces that we do have.
Yeah.
Yeah, got a little more of a refinement on the question. It's marketing or advertising ideas or suggestions about bringing storage into the warehouse.
You know, once again, I'm a firm believer in buy-in, and where you get buy-in is from having stakeholders that participate in the endeavor and the process. So kind of where my thinking is right now is getting a system and structure put in place that meets all of the needs of the various different stakeholders, and they become a fairly good advertisement tool about how to effectively use this and to work well. The word of mouth theory, right? I'm an old programmer at heart. But ultimately, I think you have to have a marketing plan and strategy that incorporates everything from traditional marketing and communication avenues to social media to, you know, live and learn type of presentations and those. So I think it's a myriad of different things, but it has to be a plan. It has to be pulled together.
And I think there's something to be said for an institution incentivizing the appropriate disposition of things. You know, we all have worked with people who I appreciate their desire to be good stewards of institutional resources. But the chair that we've held on to for 25 years that has been in 3 different offices, it's probably time for it to be retired. Like there needs to be some permission granted to say things can and do need to be disposed of. There are much more valuable things that the institution needs to be holding on to. So finding ways of communicating so that people aren't hoarding for the wrong reasons, I think is a fairly straightforward way of putting it.
I think before marketing and advertising about what you have is a strong educational plan on how to maximize and be efficient with your current operations. I would say, and I would venture a guess, most of the college campuses that you all serve on, that our policies and procedures create probably more challenges and than need be. So getting very efficient and well structured policies and procedures and being able to communicate those and to educate people, to me, would be paramount to being able to do that, because I do think we kind of create our own problems sometimes around this by creating our own troubles that we have to try to figure out how to navigate.
Okay, well, the person asking the question said thank you very much, and she agreed. So perfect answer. Thank you so much. Well, we're at the top of the hour, and again, I want to thank Carolyn and Mitch for their time today for this webinar. And as always, to our attendees, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be with us. So again, thank you very much. And as we go along during our day, let's be kind to one another. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.